Well, everybody, as we're kind of all logging in, like I said in the chat, feel free to grab whatever brings you comfort as we kind of tackle this very heavy subject. So if that's a cup of warm tea, wherever you're at, if it's 5 o'clock somewhere, if that's a glass of wine, or a blankie or whatever it is that just makes you comfortable. And just as a reminder, you guys do, not coming on screen or anything like that. So wherever you are today that makes you feel comfortable, whether that's the couch, outside, in your jammies, really, we want you to come where you are and open your hearts with us. So, well, it looks like we're actually got several people on, and let's see here. Okay, yeah. So we've got a couple people too, and it looks like they're already starting to pop on. It had this little box that says, it looks like you're talking German. I was like, I don't think I'm talking German, but I think someone else has requested the German language. So you already found it, which is amazing. So you can go on to the turn on captions. There's a little caption button, or you might have to go to the more and then go to captions to turn on your captions as you're going through, but also you can change your language on there. So if you would like to switch out of English into your native language, that is completely fine. And then also this will be recorded too. So we usually have that translation with the recording as well. All right. Well, I guess let's go ahead and get started. What do you think, Liz?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay. So let me share my screen, which is always an adventure, right? So
Doing it, Casey.
I'm doing it. I've tried to make it to where there wasn't a ton of stuff on my screen. Ta-da! Exciting. Okay. Well, I know we have probably people here that are in all stages of your journey with SCN8A. And so this is actually our fourth annual Meaningful Change series. And for those of you that don't know me, my name is Casey Craig, and I am the executive director for the Cute Syndrome Foundation. But more importantly, I am the mother to Lincoln and Stella. And Stella is my SCN8A warrior. And I'll tell you a little bit more about her later today. But I also have the remarkable Liz Ramirez with me. And Liz, I am so incredibly happy to call you not only a colleague, but a friend. And it has been so wonderful to get to know you more over the last several years. And Liz is a counselor by trade. And unfortunately, she has really gone through all the stages of grief and loss as you lost your will about 7 years ago. We were just chatting about this today, and I was like, it's about 5 years ago, right? And she was like, no, almost seven. And so I thank you so much for being here, Liz, and always being very vulnerable and honest and truthful as you share your journey with Will. And you have always been such an amazing support for our community and always open to talking to families that are going through it. And I greatly, greatly appreciate that. So as we kind of talk about Meaningful Change series, this might be your very first one that you've attended, which is completely fine. But every spring we do an educational series, and we try to pick topics that we feel like is a good beat on the community and where everybody is, and the different questions that they might be asking a lot in the support group. And so we try to kind of get the subject matter and really kind of broaden it depending on where the community is, what the community is needing. And so if you're aware, our hashtag for our awareness day, the SCN8A awareness day in February, was if you only knew. And as we were getting all these submissions in for that and the interviews, those amazing, impactful interviews that we had, and the awareness day video that we presented, we really acknowledged how much our community is carrying every day, and these tough conversations that we have to have, and these incredibly difficult decisions. And so we really wanted to take a moment and really talk about these subjects. And even though they're heavy, even though they're hard, we feel like it's really important to provide a safe place for us to be able to talk about those things. Um, so we're actually this series is kind of building a little bit. We're going to reference a previous meaningful change series. So in 2021, we had a conversation. That was how to make decisions in a medical crisis. And Liz is actually going to put that link in the chat. So then that way you can go back and reference that if you want to. So that was kind of when we dipped our toes in the water of, oh man, we have to make some really hard decisions. But we're really going to kind of even go further into that during this series. So today we're going to talk about understanding loss and grief, navigating those challenges, finding support. We're also going to then partner for the next 3 events with the Courageous Parents Network. And we're going to bring in experts such, Liz is an expert in her life and her personal or her professional life. But the Courageous Parents will hit on, making decisions and how to bring in your spouses with those decisions, bring in the doctors making those decisions. And then we're going to talk about palliative care and how that differs from hospice, or, when do you get palliative care involved in your child's life. And then we're also going to talk about end of life and what that might look like, and different things that you can put in place now, or discussions to have now to help prepare you for, unfortunately, that day that may or may not come in all of our futures. So with all of that said, I kind of have this disclaimer, and I want to make sure that everyone's aware that this could be a trigger warning for you, right? It could be where we're in it and you're fine, and then all of a sudden you're not fine and you want to step away. And that is completely fine. You can come to all of these meaningful change series events. You can come to some of them. You can come to the first 5 minutes and you're like, nope, I can't do this today. And you log off, and that is completely fine. Or you put us on mute for a bit, go have a moment, come back. It is whatever you need to do in this moment. It is recorded. You can always go back whenever you need to or you want to. Also, everybody's in a different stage of this journey. So you might be in that first couple years where you're literally just trying to survive every day. And this can't even be on your plate. It can't even be in your mind whatsoever at all. And that is okay. You might be 10 years down the road and these things are popping up into your mind more and more. And so we want to make sure that we're meeting everyone where they are, and there's a space for you, whether this is your first week that you just found out about SCN8A, or you've been in this journey for a while. We are going to approach today's presentation as a conversation. Liz and I are going to be chatting and talking about our life experiences, but then also things that we've learned along the way. We will not be giving any type of mental health advice. But we will be discussing, again, the topics and our own shared experiences. So I also want to plug in here really quickly before we get officially started, is that we have 2 sponsors for this event. We have our platinum sponsor, Neurocrine Biosciences, and our gold sponsor, Praxis Precision Medicines. And because of their amazing support, we're able to bring this series to you and get the experts in here to chat with us about these very heavy but very needed conversations. So I've talked a lot. I'm going to hand it over to Ms. Liz.
Thank you so much, Casey. Hi to everybody. I'm tempted to say good morning, but I'm in California time, so I know we're all over the place. So good afternoon, good evening. It's really wonderful to be in this space with you all. Thank you for joining us. As Casey and I were planning for this time, we really started out as wanting to just broadly understand, acknowledge, and normalize loss and grief in our community, right? It's such a common experience in our community. We don't get a lot of chances to talk about it. And I really want to kind of ground us in the idea that grief is a natural response to loss. It is natural. It's often referred to as an emotion, but I would argue that it is a whole body experience. You feel it
Mm.
physically, you feel it emotionally, relationally, spiritually, psychologically. I feel like there isn't an aspect of our beings that is not touched by grief and loss. Casey, would you mind reading this quote from one of my
Mhm.
favorite books and authors?
Absolutely. Nothing is more natural than grief. No emotion more common to our daily experience. It is an innate response to the loss in a world where everything is impermanent.
So talk about normalizing grief, right, and
Hmm.
loss. And I want to acknowledge that there can definitely be some cultural variations in how different societies view and deal with and either do or don't make space for loss and grief in our lives. But I would say largely in many societies or in American society, grief can be viewed as like terrifying and messy and something to kind of be cleaned up and kind of gotten over as soon as possible, rather than something to be tended to or supported, right? And so we really want to focus on talking about grief from that perspective, that is something to be tended to and supported and not gotten over and fixed. So we'll be
Hmm.
kind of approaching it that way today. Do you mind giving us the next slide, please, Casey?
Yeah.
This is not going to be an exhaustive list, but I think it's important to acknowledge that this community on a regular basis faces a lot of loss and grief.
Mm.
Uh, you know, there's definitely the loss of hopes and dreams you have for your child who is impacted by SCN8A, and the loss of like, you know, the desire to have a healthy child, right? Whatever that means. That can happen. That loss can happen at the onset of seizures, maybe at the point of diagnosis or when you get the genetic testing back. And Sometimes in caring for your child, right, it's their needs are so involved. There can be a loss of financial stability, loss of job and career. I know lots of folks have had to give up their careers for this, right? And also health impacts we have, right? Our backs start aching, but there's also, you know, from doing the heavy lifting. Also stress, right? There's a cumulative stress that comes with parenting an SEN8A child, right? And so these are all different types of losses.
I was going to jump in real quick,
Mhm.
Liz. I feel like on a lot of these types of grief, it's socially okay to grieve certain things,
Yeah,
and then we feel
yeah,
guilty about
yeah,
grieving other things. So, like the loss of hopes and dreams for
yeah,
our children.
yeah,
We all had in our mind this vision of what
yeah.
parenthood was going to look like. And I would venture to say that everyone on this call or watching this recording is not living that life that they
Mhm.
thought they were going to live. And so I feel like that first couple years, like
Yeah,
I felt guilty for
yeah.
grieving that. And I just want to acknowledge and validate those feelings for you or anyone else
Mhm.
that's on this call that was like, oh, I just felt guilty, wanting to have that life that I thought I was going to live.
Yeah, I think that's really important to state because, right, I think sometimes death can be the only loss that's seen as like legitimate for grieving or something
Hmm.
tangible, and that is so not true. Grieving can happen with any big loss in our lives, whether tangible or intangible, visible or invisible. And also mean it doesn't mean that, and sometimes we feel guilty for grieving it because we feel like, oh, it doesn't mean I love
Mm-hmm.
my child less, or am I not, am I, you know, or having some guilt of like, oh, I shouldn't be feeling this because it's not their fault they have SENA. Doesn't mean you love your child less. And as a matter of fact, I try
Hmm.
to turn that around. It's because you love your child so much and you wanted the best for them, and them
Hmm.
having really difficult behaviors or seizures, or you grieve that loss for them, and you grieve that loss for their siblings, right? You think about how are their siblings going to
Hmm.
be impacted, right? Not all of
Mm.
this is very visible or apparent to people in the outside of our community, or maybe outside of the medically complex community, but these are real losses even if they aren't
Hmm.
tangible. I think that's really
Hmm.
important to acknowledge, Casey. Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then we also talk about, we also, I think a lot of us experience anticipatory grief, right? So we're
Mm.
grieving the things that we've lost in the moment, but we also look ahead to the future and think about potentially our child's death, right? And all the things that we will lose in the future that have not
Hmm.
quite happened yet, right? That's, I think, a real part of our experience for many of us.
Hmm.
Um, And then there's all the actual death of our children that we have a lot of that in our community, unfortunately. And processing that the death can actually be a lot more difficult if if it was like a complex death or traumatic, if it was
Hmm.
sudden or unexpected or kind of out of order, which unfortunately is true of a lot of the deaths in our community. So it makes the grief even more complex, I would say. So
Hmm.
yeah.
Definitely.
And for me, with living through the death of my own son, we received his genetic disorder diagnosis. Well, actually, it was a variant of unknown significance, actually, back then in 2014. That was a long time ago. But we already kind of knew at that point that he was probably not going to grow out of his challenges, his developmental delays. We'd had a awful appointment with a developmental pediatrician where, he said, likely he's not going to outgrow it, right? And it was just like, one of those moments where things go black and your heart sinks. That was when Will
Hmm.
was maybe about 4. And I realized looking back, I don't think I knew then. I was grieving those first maybe like 4 to 5 years of his life of like, I don't want this. I don't want this for him. I don't want it for our whole family. I don't want it for his older brother. I was in deep grief without probably totally being aware of that. And then when Will was about 5, I think there started to be some levels of acceptance, trying to focus on living life with him and enjoy him. And then Will died very suddenly of SUDEP at the age of 7.5. And I just felt like I was plunged back into that world of grief, which at that point kind of felt familiar. It was just kind of a different nuance of grief. And it felt like, especially maybe in the first year to 2 years after Will's death, I felt like I was walking around with like this gaping wound. Like it just hurt to be alive. It hurt to breathe, but it wasn't visible to people. So I don't think people realized how much I was hurting and how all consuming the grief was for me. And so there's that kind of the primary loss, the death of your loved one, and there's so many secondary losses that come with that. And I think that's true of also like a diagnosis, right? There's the primary loss of like the diagnosis. Okay, they have a genetic disorder that they'll never outgrow, right? But then it has a lot of like kind of downstream effects, like impacts on relationships and previously held like religious or spiritual beliefs. There's just a whole world of loss, I think, involved in this community.
Hmm.
And Casey, I think like what you're saying, like your grief, like in whatever form it may take right now or in the future, it's just really important to support that, to tend to it,
Hmm.
even if people say you can only grieve a death, which is not true, right? Even if it's intangible. And then I think, especially because if people aren't understanding us, right? That makes us feel even more isolated, right? More alone, more misunderstood than we already do, perhaps. So we just want to take the space to like validate it, right? Legitimize what your experience, acknowledge it. That's one of the reasons this community is so important and so meaningful to me, is that we understand what it's like to be at the bottom of the pit, right?
Hmm.
Sometimes there's no fix for these things, right? We don't fix a genetic disorder. But what we need is for an understanding friend or community to come sit with us in the darkness for a while and to start helping us navigate that world, right? I love somebody had shared, I think, in our Facebook support group a while ago. I loved it, the little meme of like, okay, so a special needs parent falls into a hole, right?
Mm.
And the local authority says, sorry, there's not enough money for a ladder. And then a charity says, oh, fill out this form and you can wait for a ladder. And then a family member might say, what hole? They don't even acknowledge you're in a hole in the darkness,
Right?
right? It's so
Oh,
true sometimes, sad but
yeah.
true. But then the other SCN8 parent comes in on a Facebook support group and says, I'm here. I'm on my way down, right? I've been there before. I know how to get out and I won't leave you alone. And they descend into the pit with us, sit with us for a while in our darkness, and then start helping us when we are ready to navigate rung by rung how to get out of there. And that is what I feel like this community is and why I love you all so much. So
Yes, I'm already getting tears.
yeah.
Because that's 100%. I remember when we got Stella's genetic diagnosis, she was 5 months old, and I hated the diagnosis.
Yeah.
But once
Yes.
I got into the support group, I was like, holy cow, I've hit jackpot with these amazing people that I can vent to, that will celebrate us. And then they'll understand without judgment. And I think that is very unique, as I've gone and talked to other, rare genetic disorders or other, life-threatening illnesses. And I think it's important to recognize the lack of judgment in our group and how important that is and how amazing we all are of supporting one another regardless of where we're at in our
Yeah.
journey. And it's remarkable,
Yeah.
absolutely remarkable.
We're so fortunate.
Mm-hmm. I just love you all. I'll just plug that in there. So, Liz, you want me to kind of start talking a little bit
Yeah.
about my Stella?
Yes, please.
So, I know some of you may not know Stella, especially if you're new to the group. So Stella is 8. I should say 8.5, right? You always, at this age, I feel like you always have to throw the half in there. So she's 8.5. And she was diagnosed when she was about 5 months old with SCN8A. She started having seizures when she was 6 weeks old. And the first several years were extremely difficult. Our local children's hospital is over 4.5 hours away. We were airlifted multiple times, more ambulance rides than I can count. She is on the severe side of SCNA, meaning she is nonverbal, no head, neck, or trunk control, limited extremity control, G tube, sleep apnea. Her room looks like a little mini PICU now that we have all the equipment that we need to help take care of her here. And so I think, just to acknowledge and think about like the person I was before having Stella and the person what I am now. And before having Stella, I probably had some anxiety. It runs pretty strong in my family, so I probably had some anxiety there. But it really didn't become necessarily a problem or become issues with me kind of living my life until after having Stella. Um, I at the beginning of her life, she cried a lot at night, cried
Mm.
and cried and cried. We had no idea why. My husband and I would take 3-hour shifts. She would cry for 3 hours with him, then I would be in bed with a pillow over my head trying to get sleep, and then we would flip flop. And I remember one night it just got to be too much. It was so much. And there's nothing I could do. Right. And I can't be upset at her because
Yeah.
she can't help it either. And I started pulling my hair and just pulling to release that anger and that stress. And it was in that moment that I was like, you know what? I might need some medication. I think I'm there. Right.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of where my journey went a little bit with starting with a medication for anxiety. I went into my primary care and I said, hey, I just want something for the really bad days. Can you just give me something to kind of, help with that? And she said, well, how often are bad days or what does a bad day look like? And I'm like, well, she's in status or clustering a lot or blah, blah, blah. And she's like, well, how often does that happen? Well, it could really happen at any moment. And she goes, let's just actually go ahead and give you something daily. And I was
Mm.
like,
Mm.
okay, well, I didn't know how I felt about that, right? There's a
Mm.
stigma on medication and
Mm.
taking it, unfortunately. And so I said yes. And I went ahead and started taking it, and that did help. It helped.
Mm.
I was very quick to react and to respond to anger at things that had nothing to
Mm.
do with Stella
Yeah.
or did have something to do with Stella. And that anxiety medicine did for sure help. Um, and then, I also then went into where I felt like I needed to almost like prepare myself, right? Of what's going to happen in the future. And I am still terrified of when,
Mhm.
if something happens to Stella, like, what's that going to do to my family?
Mhm.
What's that going to do to my marriage? What is that
Mhm.
going to do to her older brother that loves her so much? Like, how is that going to happen? How's that work? And so I started telling myself, like, I I need to prepare for this as my type A personality took over, right? And so one of the first things I did was get a counselor. And it's interesting to me that I got a counselor so I could prepare for the inevitable grief of my daughter. And
Mm.
how messed up is that? Like when you think about it,
Mhm.
like how crazy
Mhm.
is that that
Mhm.
that's where we go and where we
Yeah.
have to go,
Yeah.
right? Um so I've been seeing a counselor for actually probably 4 years or so. I started with a different one, and I don't know about you, but it took me a while to find like my person.
Yeah.
The first person I talked to, um, she was like, "Good job, you're doing great. Hang in there." And I'm like, okay, like thank you, but you're not giving me anything here. And so I took a break from counseling for a while, and then I found my person, and she has been extremely helpful for me. Um, and then also, I this last summer, when Stella was having a lot of hip issues, her Korea movements were out of control. Um, Essentially all these hopes and dreams that I thought were going to happen over that next year just like poof went away. And that's when I really started feeling those feelings of depression and feeling very hopeless, and that the future was never going to be good again. I was never going, nothing was going to feel stable again. Um, you know, why am I here? Why are we doing this? That whole, just really, really heavy, sad feelings. And so luckily, I feel like I was pretty educated on anxiety and depression and grief and things like that. And so I went back to my primary care and said, okay, these are the feelings I'm having, and I feel like I need some medication to help with this. And
Mhm.
I was already in counseling. I was already trying to take walks. I was already had a supportive, group that I could go to and talk to. And so that seemed to be the natural step. So to keep you, or to kind of give you a perspective, before I had Stella, I was literally taking like a multivitamin and Flonase from time to time. And now I'm on 3 different
Yeah.
medications for anxiety and depression. And, um, that sometimes feels like, ugh, like I'm not winning, right? Like, I have to take these medications to be okay. But I feel better now on these medications and in counseling than I did in the beginning, by far. And so I do, it's important to really think about what do you need and be open um, to whether it's medications or therapies or anything like that to help get you through.
Yeah. Can I jump in
Oh,
there? I just think
yes,
your
yes.
therapist comment about, I think I would recommend a daily thing that just speaks to the daily challenges that we face. Like
Hmm.
every day can be very, very hard, right? We're grateful for the
Yeah.
moments that our kids are okay, but you just never know what will change from one minute to the next. I think that
Hmm.
speaks to the truth of our community, right? And also
Yes,
about the
definitely.
counselor fit, I can't emphasize that enough that there are a lot of counselors out there with a lot of their therapists with different styles. And I encourage you to keep on, it can be exhausting, but you keep on going until you find one that feels like a fit. And you'll know when that
Hmm.
happens because that's really important that you have that fit.
Hmm.
Yeah, that's key.
Yeah, and what's going to fit with your life too, right? So, like, I personally go physically to my counselor, but other people may have to where they go to like Better Health or something like that that's online. So that way they don't have to leave their house. And that might be easier for you too. It just kind of depends on where you're at. But yeah, trying to find a good fit is super important. I also kind of want to talk a little bit too about other things that I've used to kind of help out. I have a trauma informed massage therapist, which I had no idea even existed. And it was my counselor that actually mentioned it. Stress and grief can really like hang out in certain portions of your body. And she's amazing at like finding those spots and helping me release. I've literally like been on the massage table, and the next thing you know, I am bawling my eyes out.
Mm.
And certain, visions of things came out, and I'm like, wow, how did she do that? So I highly encourage, looking into something like that. Something else that I found extremely helpful um, is our Pathway to Peace program that we partnered with Kara, and I always say her last name, it's wrong. It's either Kara Reiska or Riska. I can never remember. But she's the host of the Special Needs podcast and Special Needs Mom podcast. And what Pathway to Peace did for me, and I'm saying this as a plug, obviously, because we help with this program, but mainly because I just want everyone to know about this. Um, it helped me so much with my anxiety, with work and life balance, um, feeling the feelings as they come up, recognizing my body and when those feelings come up and where I'm finding or where I'm feeling those and how to work through them. One thing that I'll just use this as an example, one thing that I told myself every single day of my life for probably the 8.5 years was there's too much to do and not enough time to do it. And every morning I would wake up and in my
Mm.
chest, my heart was beating. I had that fluttery feeling. I just had all this anxiety of I don't have enough time to do it. There's so much to do. How am I going to do it all? And she really went through this whole process of like, okay, write down everything you have to do on a piece of paper. Now we're going to scratch out all the things that can wait till next week. Now we're going to prioritize and we're going to put it on your schedule. And I could physically see hour by hour that I had enough time. I
Mm.
did have enough time. And I started scheduling self care in there. I'm going to work in my garden for 1 hour on Friday, or I'm going to do this for, this amount of time. I'm going to take a tea break for 15 minutes here. And because if I don't schedule it, it doesn't
Yeah.
get done. And so that's just one of the things that Kara helped me to see and to accomplish. And it has been life altering to not just, my professional, but my personal life as well. So if you have more questions about Pathway to Peace, I would be more than happy to chat with you about that. And then I also kind of want to just back up a little bit because I went over this and I meant to hit it. When you were talking about anticipatory grief, and just grief in general and how it can pop up really randomly. And
Mm.
I feel like after probably year 5-ish, I got to that point of accepting, right? You kind of,
Yeah.
the first couple years you're surviving, you're
Yeah.
just like, just trying to live. And then after that, it was like, okay, I'm in this life. I'm starting to get supports. I feel like we're like thriving and not just surviving.
Yep.
And so I started to get on that road, right? Or that journey. And then I have these moments that still pop up of when grief creeps in, and just acknowledging that that's completely normal and validating that. We were talking before this, and some of the things that pop up were like um, seeing peers of Stella's age, right? So I'm like, we're at a birthday party or our family's out bowling, and there's this other little girl that's also 8.5, and she's running and happy and just laughing and doing all these things. And sometimes it's like,
Yeah.
yeah, that hurts,
Yeah.
right? Um, and then like any type of secondary diagnosis that pops up is always like just a kick to the gut, right? And I know when Stella, at one point in time, she had an ABR to test her hearing, and I'm trying to console her in the recovery room, and the audiologist comes up and said, "Okay, we found moderate hearing loss. We're recommending hearing aids," and I just lost it. And it wasn't because of the hearing aids, and I think that's what she thought. She was like, "Well, you can get really cute colors," but I'm like, "It's not the hearing aids. It's that this child is enduring
Right. Right.
one more thing on top of all the other things."
Right.
Um, so yeah, those things hit hard. Or going to a wedding and realizing my husband's not going to walk Stella down the aisle.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm not, she's not going to have grandkids.
Yeah.
All those things that you just believe your life will include. Um, and
Yeah.
so even if you're feeling good and accepted, in that acceptance phase,
Mm-hmm.
um, those things, those milestone birthdays, Stella's first birthday, what she got was a shower chair. What?
Ouch.
On her
Yeah.
first birthday,
Mm-hmm.
that's what we had to buy her was
Mm-hmm.
a shower chair. And it was like,
Yeah.
of course she
Yeah.
had a few other things, but honestly, the most beneficial for her was the shower chair.
Yeah. Yeah. My
And
husband and
those
I
things
would call
hurt.
those sucker punches when we'd see kids
Mm,
who are Will's age and just like, oh my gosh, that's, that's almost of his typical
Mhm.
typically developing peers were doing. Those are really hard
Mhm.
moments.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. When
And
all the
I,
other kids are going to school or
yeah,
driving.
yep.
Mhm.
And I still have, it wasn't until I was talking to you, I was like, oh, I still have anticipatory grief, right? Like, so Ethan's older brother is 16, almost 17 now. And so we went to prom this past weekend, and I was started to think about like, oh, I'm very sad that, if Ethan gets married, Will won't be part of that. And if Ethan ever
Mm.
has kids, they will never get to meet their uncle. Like
Mhm.
that like I still experience that 7 years out, thinking of right, it's
Mhm.
not the loss in that certain point of time. It is a continual loss of not having that
Yeah.
person in your life,
Yeah.
now and in the future. Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
And as we were preparing for the session, I think you asked me a couple things. Like,
Mhm.
are there things you wish that you had known, things that you wish you had done differently? I think one thing the first thing that came to mind was like, it was actually in thinking about and considering Will's mortality that helped me focus on living in the moment as much as I could when Will was
Mhm.
alive, right? Improving the quality of his life, being present to him, right? As opposed to being so focused on therapy. We did therapy his whole life, but it kind of shifted from like, oh, we're gonna do all these things in therapy. We're gonna enjoy him as well, right? And that was really important. I'm so grateful for this because we only had 7.5 short years with him. And I'm so grateful that it took me a while to get there, but we did have moments where I could really just enjoy him, relish in his company. I'm so grateful for that.
Mhm.
I think, I think looking back to on my grieving process, right, the thoughts of experiencing like intensity of grief and sorrow after having lost a child, like seem really, really intolerable. Right? If you think about how our bodies react to pain, like you're in the kitchen and you touch the hot pan, you automatically like pull back, right? That's just our brain trying to protect us from pain. Our bodies don't want to be in pain. Same, and I think the same applies emotionally, right? But the problem is that when we turn away from pain that's caused by grief, we can actually end up intensifying our pain, right? And we end up having to close parts of ourselves off. If we try to suppress our grief, it can flare up. It can impact our relationships negatively. It can impact our emotional, even our physical health. We see that.
Mhm.
And unfortunately, the feelings of loss don't just go away. Ironically, if we bury them, right, they actually tend to go deeper. And so we can
Mhm.
only heal what we allow ourselves to feel. And so I encourage us all to have safe spaces to do that, right? And again, our task isn't to fix ourselves or anybody around us. It's just to allow the space and the permission for that grief to show up so we can tend to it, right? I wish I had
Mhm.
known some of these things when I was going through
Mhm.
it, right? And being present with our grief and aware of it can actually soften it, right?
Mhm.
I still don't like to face it, right? Mother's Day is hard, Will's birthday is hard, and I
Mhm.
can feel myself being like, oh, I don't want to do this. But the best I can do is allow myself, give myself the permission to be like, I'm going to let whatever comes up, and I'm going to have space and time to do
Mhm.
that. I still have to do that
Mhm.
these days. Yeah.
Yeah. Liz, you mentioning we've been talking about this for a couple weeks on how we were going to present this, and you mentioned that knowing that Will's life was probably going to be shortened, it
Mhm.
really allowed you to focus on that. What can we do now while and really live in the present? And I feel like I've done that fairly well, but last summer when Stella's hip and
Yeah.
issues in Korea and increased seizures and all of that, and it just really made me think, oh, we just can't do anything fun now. All the
Yeah.
things I thought we were going to do, maybe a family vacation, or we had talked about her going to Camp Barnabas, like all that was just poof, gone.
Yep.
And when we were talking about this like a week and a half ago, I thought, you know what? She's actually doing fairly well right now. I wonder if maybe she could go to Camp Barnabas. Maybe, okay, let's think about this. And so you just like talking about that really reminded me like I need to act on this. And so I called. I got the last appointment in the medical well house for Stella, and she's going to Camp Barnabas in July. And it still makes me cry
Yeah.
because I mean it's the big things, but it's also the little things. Like I
Yes.
didn't have nursing care on Wednesday, and I at first was in a panic because I'm like, how am I going to get all this done without any help? But then it was like, you know what? I'm clearing my afternoon and Stella and I are going to go plant shopping. So I loaded her up in the van. We went to Lowe's. She had a seizure before we left. She slept half away, but you know what? When she woke up, she was very happy. And I got to spend an afternoon at Lowe's looking at plants with my daughter. And so
Yeah.
again, I just want to thank you
Mhm.
for reminding me of that. And so I could have some of those moments
Yeah.
of joy and not and just really, hey, Stella's okay right now in this very
Mhm.
moment. And so we're gonna do it.
And it never feels like enough, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
right, because there's always that like what's going to happen, but we can't live in that because we don't know,
Mm-mm.
right? So we can only
Mm-hmm.
live in this moment of the kid's okay, and I'm going to try to enjoy that and really, really just be present to that. That's what we have, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's true for all of our lives. We have to have the present moment, right? Yeah,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I
yeah.
love what you just said was we have to feel the feelings, but we don't want to live there,
Yeah.
right? We don't
Mm-hmm.
want to just, yeah, live in the
Yeah.
sorrow, feel it,
Yeah.
but
Mm-hmm.
not live there.
Mm-hmm. Talking about the wisdom of our community, we had decided not to monitor Will because the monitoring technology was not very good. There were a lot of false alarms, and Will's sleep was already
Mm-hmm.
really messed up. And when he wasn't sleeping well, he had even worse seizures. And so we had decided not to monitor. So obviously, when he died of SUDEP, that we had moments of like, oh my gosh, what should have we done differently and regret. But Julianne, who was in the group, she had said some just these wise words that I want to share with this group because they sunk so deeply in me. She said, the only decision that's the right decision is the one that you make out of love for your child, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
sometimes we make decisions to change medications or stop medications that we're trying to do out of love for our kids. And they end up being, the kids end up, having more seizures or having other difficulties. We did not know that, right? And so that is something that I think we all need to be reminded of, that the only decision, we don't have all the information. The only right decision is the one we make out of love. And I remember when I would have moments of regret about not monitoring Will, my husband would remind me of that on a walk. Remember, we did that out of love because it was going to mess up his sleep. We just didn't know he was going to have a suit up episode, right? And so I have
Mm-hmm.
quite a bit of peace. Like we made all of our decisions out of deep love for him. So I always
Mm-hmm.
remind myself about that. A
Mm.
very practical consideration, because Will died so suddenly and unexpectedly. We, in addition to like all this, the practical things, we were trying to do like donate parts of his brain and his skin tissue to science. So I was like, I want to help the community. I know that Will would want
Mhm.
that. But obviously, if we had had prior arrangements, that would have been better. And so it wasn't until years later I was like, oh, you can actually do that. So I'm going to share some links in the chat if anybody wants
Yeah.
to check that out. We were able to, I think, donate some of his like RNA, but it's just you don't
Mhm.
want to have to be dealing with that, when you're dealing with your child having just passed. So
Yeah, the links that Liz is sharing with us right now is with Deep Connections. So Gabi Conacher is one of the co-founders of Deep Connections, and they have two different webinars on brain tissue donation. And I think, yep, the first one that she is sharing is three mothers that lost their children to other rare disorders, and they talk about their experience about brain tissue donation and what it looked like. And then the second one is also through Deep Connections, and that is more the science of it, of like why it matters to donate brain tissue and things like that. So I also want to just recognize that, and that this is 100% a personal decision.
yep,
Um, if you want to donate, fantastic. If you don't, that's okay too.
yep,
That is 100% okay. And I just think, like what you were saying, one thing that this has been on my mind recently was I don't want to have to be worrying about making those phone calls and filling out all the forms when I'm trying to spend time, the last moments with my daughter.
yep,
And so, what I think it's important is for us to start looking, or for me, my family, is to start looking at different brain banks and maybe starting to get that process rolling. So that is said and done. And if we change our mind later, that's okay too. But then that way I'm not having to spend those last moments with my
yep.
daughter thinking about and calling different brain banks. So these two podcasts, or not podcasts, webinars are amazing. Highly encourage you guys to go out and look at that and see if it's a right fit for your family. Also, when we're talking about like some practical considerations too, so when Stella was in and out of the hospital a lot, that's when her neurologist recommended that we go see palliative care. And we're going to have a whole section over palliative care and what that looks like. But I was really confused when I was like,
Yeah.
what is this? I don't understand what we're talking about. Why are we even here? And so I showed up to the appointment having no clue what we were going to talk
Mm,
about. And they really just talked about like what our family looked like. And, and then at one point they said, what is your biggest fear? What's your biggest fear right now? And in that moment, it was, Stella was going to have a seizure in the middle of the night. We wouldn't know it. And I'd wake up and I would know that she was gone. And like, what do we do? How do we
mhm,
handle that?
mhm.
And so they discussed an outpatient DNR form. And that is when we started really thinking about, okay, is this something that we want? And it took us about 3 months to decide. And when we went in for another pretty intense hospitalization, I was like, okay, my husband and I are like, yeah, we want that form. And it's a form we keep with us. Really, no one else even knows about it, but it gives us the choice that if we know Stella's gone, we can have this form available so we can spend as much time with her in our wherever she has passed. Mostly likely we would use this form if she passed in our home, and we wouldn't have to call 911 right away. We could really just spend that time with her in a quiet, relaxed, comforting environment, instead of us having to call 911. And even if I'm like, no, don't do CPR, and they have to keep, do
Right.
CPR or do all these interventions
Right.
that, I we don't want. And so
Mm,
having that form was scary, but
yeah.
it also gave me comfort and peace knowing that we had it in case we needed it. And that was the decision that we were going to make um, in that moment, because we loved Stella so much and love her so much that
Mm,
we didn't want our last moments to be in chaos and
yep.
medical tubes everywhere. We wanted it
Yep.
to be a moment that we could embrace her.
Yeah. Yeah. It's important for us to know that we have choices, right? In
Hmm.
planning and thinking ahead to those moments should they come. Hmm.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was reading the other day, I think a email, and it posed a question of like, is the death of a child a life sentence of pain? And you know,
Mm.
all I can say to that is another book recommendation from the Murmur of Bees, Sophia Segovia. She kind of renders this beautiful analogy that has been for me the closest to my experience, because there's lots of analogies for grief, is that
Hmm.
like when you suffer a terrible loss, and you're grieving, it's like a huge boulder with lots of sharp edges, but that boulder
Hmm.
is submersed in water, and as time passes by and the water passes over the rock, right, the really sharp edges are smoothed down, so those no longer
Hmm.
remain, but the weight of the boulder remains. And that has been very true for
Hmm.
me, is that, like I said, it just hurt to be alive the first year and a half after Will died. It felt like breathing hurt. Now, though, I carry the weight of missing him. I never stop yearning to be with him. I never stop missing him because I will never stop loving him. And I love that, actually, but I always feel the weight of missing him. So that would be my
Hmm.
answer to that. It's kind of it's a yes and no, but I would say that the nature of the grief does change, not just by passage of time, but by trying to be intentional about healing. And I think that's important, to be intentional about healing.
I think that one thing that really stood out to me about you, Liz, is I remember us having, I think it was like a volunteer meeting,
Mm-hmm.
and I think it was at Baltimore, I believe,
Yeah.
in
Mm-hmm.
2019. And you and Roland were in that
Mm-hmm.
room, and seeing you both in that room and active in our community, I'm gonna tear up. Um, it gave me hope. It gave me hope that there was life
Yeah.
after our life with Stella,
Yep.
and it was going to be hard
Yep.
and it was going to be painful,
Yep.
but seeing you guys still joke around and laugh and smile, it gave me hope
Yeah.
that there was something else. So
There is
thank you
still
for that.
life. It looks different, but there is
Hmm.
still life. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Um, we are going to talk about the grief recovery method in just a bit, and I know this time is going by so quickly.
Yeah.
But you were talking about grief as a boulder. There was also this analogy that I learned in the grief recovery method, and it talks about grief as this backpack that you
Yep.
wear. And you get this backpack when you're born, right? As soon as you're born and you're out of the womb and you're like, wait, I'm not in that comfy, warm spot anymore.
Yeah.
And a little rock is dropped into your backpack. And
Hmm.
as these moments of grief pile up, these rocks are dropped into the backpack. And some rocks are bigger, some rocks are smaller, but they still add up, right? It's cumulative. And then you get to the point where this backpack is so heavy that you can't carry it anymore.
Hmm.
And some people's backpacks are filled up and then they get the SCN8A diagnosis. And then
Hmm.
it's like, I can't, right? You have to
Hmm.
take the bag off and you have to do something differently. Other people, it might be the diagnosis is a big rock. And then as these secondary diagnoses or hospital stays and all these things are piling up, but either way, that backpack is going to get too full for you to carry.
Hmm.
And how important it is to kind of open up that backpack and start picking up some of these pieces of grief and feeling the feelings and working through those. So you're not having to carry that heavy backpack with you
Hmm.
wherever you go.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. And that speaks to the just importance of like self-care throughout our lives, right?
Mm-hmm,
Trying to be
mm-hmm,
intentional about healing. And back to kind of your original point of like, we just need to make the space for feeling these things and working through them, processing the losses, right? Mm-hmm.
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 Yeah.
Definitely.
Mm,
I know
lots and
we
lots of
only have
stuff.
like 9 more minutes, huh?
I
So
know. Okay, yeah. Do you want to move on to the next slide?
yeah, what we could do, Casey, Casey and I were figuring it might go a little bit over. So
Mm-hmm,
what we could do is we can probably skip over this because this will be in the recording, but I love this is another really good book. It's okay that you're not
mm-hmm,
okay. So if you get a chance to check it out. Um, and then coping with grief basics. I just could kind of put in some, but what we can do is we'll probably share this
mm-hmm.
recording and maybe I can add some points in the chat or in the comment
Mm-hmm.
that we didn't get to because I want to make sure that we get to the last slide where we're talking about the supports because I think that's really
Yeah.
important. But what I will say is like you can't not grieve when you've faced a significant loss, right? In the same way they can't not bleed if you suffer a deep cut, right? And grief is the natural and healthy way for us to process all of that experience, right? Half the battle is just allowing yourself to grieve. Feelings aren't right and wrong. You can talk through things. You can write messages to your loved ones. You can journal. Crying, let yourself cry and have crying sessions. You actually, when you cry emotional tears, you're actually letting out some of your stress hormones. They're chemically different than tears that you like when you like, I don't know, hit your elbow or something different. They're
Mm-hmm.
releasing stress hormones. Just making sure that, you're aware of like myths about grief that it should be gotten through in a certain way or should look a certain way or only last a certain amount of time. Those are not true, right? And there is rebuilding and remembering, right? So whether that's rebuilding after the diagnosis or after the loss of your child, right? You can't pick up the pieces and put them back together the way that they were before because there are pieces that are missing, right? Or there's a new
Mm-hmm.
diagnosis, but you can rebuild in a way that's meaningful and it never replaces the meaning of being with your child, but you can still continue to live a life that honors them, that honors their memory, by living that life. So for me, that's like volunteering with Acute Syndrome Foundation, or even just in a hard moment with a colleague at work, remembering to be kind with him. That's Will. That's Will still
Mm-hmm.
continuing to live out his legacy in the world as I see it. So yeah.
I love that. I like that. Oh,
Yeah, and
I
I can
think
put yeah, I
yeah.
tried to cover them real quickly, but I can probably
Yeah, you
elaborate a
did.
little bit on them. So I talk real quickly when I try to get through stuff. So we just chat a lot. So, but I wanted to make sure we get to the last slide where
Mm-hmm.
where
Mm-hmm.
we can cover some of the supports for folks who would like to um,
Yeah.
look at them.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the programs we have, but I also want you to be thinking if there's one thing that you can take from this conversation. It doesn't have to be a big thing. It can be a little thing. It may be, you know what? I think I need to take out 15 minutes a day to have a cup of tea outside. Or, you know what? I need to have a conversation with my primary care. I think maybe medication would be helpful for me. Or maybe I need to look into therapy or something like that. It could be something big, it can be small, but be thinking of one thing that you can do for yourself to help you through this crazy life of SCNA, right? I already talked about Pathway to Peace quite a bit. So it is a six month process or cohort. It's typically an hour, 2 to 3 times a month. Um, and it is, like I said, life changing. TCSF offers scholarships, so you can attend it completely free. So I think our second cohort is wrapping up this summer. So we might be looking at another cohort this fall. So I will keep you guys posted about that. We also have the grief recovery method, and this can happen in one-on-one sessions or it can be in group. I'm actually just finishing up my first one-on-one grief recovery method with an SCN8A parent, and it's really it I went through it myself during the training, um, but it can be really on any grief. Maybe you're really having struggling with a relationship of your past, a parent or a grandparent, and that is causing you to have all this other noise, if you will, to where it's weighing heavy on you. And if you had that one rock out of your backpack, maybe it would feel a bit lighter. And so I know the one-on-one grief recovery is 1 hour a week for 7 weeks. With the one-on-one, it's really easy to be flexible. Life happens, so we've had to shuffle some stuff around, and that is completely okay. So feel free to reach out to me, Karen, Shelly, or Liz about the grief recovery method. Another section of that we also receive training on is helping children with loss. And this is for adults, not children. But this program really helps you kind of be cognizant of how to talk to kids about any type of loss. It could be a loss, significant loss, like loss of a sibling or a parent or grandchild or grandparent or something like that. But it could be they didn't make the baseball team, and what's the first thing we want to tell our kids? Oh, it'll be fine. It's no big
Right.
deal. But that to them is a very
Right.
significant loss.
Right.
And so really it has helped me a lot be aware of the things that I'm, telling Lincoln and letting him feel his feelings and
Mhm.
putting a name to that feeling, right? Oh,
Mm,
that's really disappointing, isn't it, bud? And he's like, yeah, that really hurts.
mm,
And so that has just really helped. So we also have that program that would be in a group setting. We also have the Connor James Smith Patient Assistant Grant. I'm going to plug this here because as we're talking about the joy, this grant really is for anything that's going to help your family or your child. Whether it's an outside play set so they can play outside with their siblings, if it's a trampoline, if it's a medical equipment, if it's a jogger, a
mhm.
stroller jogger, so they can get out with your family, if it's a walker, a stander, all these things are options for this grant. So I would encourage you to, if you're not sure if something's going to fit, if you think it would work, send me a message. I'd be more than happy to kind of talk you through it.
Mhm. And then we have the wisdom and the why, the love of our support group. I think which many of
Mhm.
you are probably on. And that's where, I mean, things like I said, that Julian's wisdom and that meme of just like things that have just been so, this is it's an impossible task we've been given, and it is a
Mhm.
daily challenge. And it means the world to have this community who really understands and is compassionate and caring and wise and has so much resources, right?
Yeah.
It's such a gift. So and then for the parents who have lost a child, we also have a Facebook bereavement support group, so that you don't have to be alone in your journey of managing and kind of walking that journey of grief. Mhm.
Yeah.
So,
Real quick, because I know we're running out of time, but I want
yeah.
to plug when we're talking about the family support group, I just want to make sure everyone knows it is for anyone and everyone. I think from other parents have kind of chatted with me that sometimes when their child isn't on the severe end, that they feel almost guilty
Right.
sharing their challenges or venting or even sharing their successes because they're, oh well, it's just a behavioral thing, at least I'm not in the hospital and to pick you. And I want to validate and recognize that your feelings are just as important as ours. that are on the more severe end. And we want to see your kids' success. And we hope to be, somewhat helpful in the things that you need help with. And so feel free, no matter what your child's symptoms of SCN8A look like, we want you to be
Yep.
honest and open, vent all the things that you need to do. I just don't want anyone to feel like that is not a safe place for them.
100%. Yep.
Liz, thank you. I'm so happy we had this conversation. I'm
Yeah.
so happy you were here. And I hope everyone else, I know again, I don't want to say enjoyed it because of the topic that we're discussing, but I'm glad that we have this group to be able to discuss these things and be honest and open about. So thank you for being here. Um, I guess we'll open it up. I know we have just a few minutes, and actually we can always open it up in a discussion in the Facebook group too, but for questions. So if there's any questions you have, put it in the chat box real quick. And as I'm kind of finishing up here, we can go back and look at the chat. But we definitely want you to be on our next call, which is decisions, and more decisions. And we're going to have Jennifer Seidman with us. She is with the Courageous Parents Network, and she's going to be talking about, when we're faced with these horrible, awful decisions that we have to make. Also, I didn't know this even existed, but when she was talking about it was anticipatory decision regret. And I was like, oh my gosh, yes, to where you're like, oh, but what if I didn't make the right decision? And
Yeah.
what's that going to look like? And how bad am I going to feel if I made the wrong decision?
Yeah.
And so I'm really looking forward to our conversation with her. And so that's going to be on May 22nd at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. It will be the same link, Zoom link that we used today to make it easy and simple for you to join. And so we'd love to have you there. And then one more shout out to our sponsors, our platinum sponsor, Neurocrine, and our gold sponsor, Praxis, as they made all of this happen. Thank you, everyone. I was just looking through the chat. Did you see any questions, Liz, on the chat?
Karen responded a lot. Thank you, Karen. So, and
Thank
more like
you,
comments and
Karen.
sharing of experiences. Yeah, we appreciate your being here. Thank you, everybody.
Absolutely. Thank you. And we'll share the recording as soon as possible. And Liz and I will kind of work on maybe some of those details we weren't able to get to today. So thank you, everyone. Have a
Thank you,
lovely day.
everybody. Yeah.